Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel for another video. This episode will revolve largely around chip strategy for the last 10 races or so for F1 Fantasy, and you might see a very familiar face on screen here today, my friend Adam from the Fantasy Formula. Adam, as I'm sure many of you know, is one of the most vocal and involved members of the F1 Fantasy community. And I have had the privilege, as I'm sure many of you also know, of co-hosting the Fantasy Formula in a previous part of my life. But again, I can't speak highly enough of Adam and his contributions to the F1 Fantasy community, so I wanted to get him on, talk all things chip strategy. And if you guys know how my guest interview series works, we will do a quiz at the end. Adam, thank you for coming on, my friend. How are you? What's the latest?
Oh, Rob, you're too kind. It's so great to be on. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for our show today. We have a lot of chip stuff to talk about, and I'm a little bit nervous for the quiz later, but I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it'll be good. I'm looking forward to it. It's been a bit of a challenging segment of the show when I've had guests on, but I'm sure you'll be able to navigate. There's not many more people in F1 Fantasy that know the game inside out like you. So we'll save that for the end, but hopefully for the next 20 or so minutes, we can unpack chips and all that good stuff that comes with it. Before we jump into the discussion, how has it been enjoying? I know we're largely focusing this conversation, around the last 10 races or so. We're in the midst of the closing stages of the summer break. This will probably go out after Zandvoort or around Monza's time, so bear with me for those of you watching. But how's your head getting back into the swing of things after a few weeks off?
I'll tell you, it was really nice to have a relaxing break with no F1 and also not really any F1 news until some of the Cadillac driver announcements earlier this week. So we got to just have a guilt-free 3-4 weeks of really disconnecting with family, refreshing, getting a little extra sleep. So I'm back and my batteries are recharged. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I'm ramping up for the last 10 races. It's going to be a good one. And I think that's the most exciting part for the closing stages of the year, is that chips seem to be flowing thick and fast for the most part. I know you and I have used a handful already, but we'll go through all 6 regardless, because I'm sure many of you might have a full pocket of them up your sleeve. But let's kick things off with Limitless, because I know you and I, and it's probably one of the most powerful chips in the game, you and I have both used our Limitless chips at different races this season as well, mind you. And it is, I think, something that can really put ground on the rest of the field. We've got 10 races, 3 sprints, and I think I'd love to just get your thoughts generally. I know there are different times that we can use the Limitless chip to varying degrees of success, but for someone that might still have it up their sleeve, we've got mini leagues as well. Is there a time that stands out to you, or do you think there's a couple of different opportunities we could kick things off with using Limitless?
So I think for a regular team, it definitely makes sense to use it on a non-sprint weekend, because the next sprint weekend is COTA in October. So you've got a long break between now and then. By October, those budgets are going to be so high for some of the big spenders that a Limitless team might not have such a big advantage by that time. So I would recommend using it in the next few races if you have a regular team. And of course, we have the mid-season Masters mini league that's starting this weekend. And so if you're watching this before Zandvoort, maybe using one for Zandvoort would be good too.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting tracks that spring to mind for me, because you pointed out that the later in the season we go, the less value and upside it has to increase that delta, as we've talked about before. Are there those? I guess if we take Monaco as a good example, because it did work well for a number of people, but to equal success, Miami was also quite good as well. If we look at these non-sprint weekends that have lower overtakes, are there any circuits that stick out to you? Are there tracks that are maybe less risk, low DNFs, or non-street circuits that maybe speak to you as potential candidates for Limitless?
Sticking with the theme of as soon as possible, I actually really like Monza, because as fast as you can go there, there's a lot of DRS trains there. In the last 2 seasons, it's finished on the bottom half of the calendar for overtakes, and also last season had very few DNFs. So as long as it stays dry, I'm happy to use it at Monza.
Yeah, it actually worked really well 2 years ago, if you can remember, where a lot of people piled in on Ferrari and Mercedes, if I think that was the combination or something to that effect, after they dominated free practice. And I think it was Andrew who won the Global League the year prior, or maybe it was the year before that. Someone I remember that's a mainstay in the community used the Limitless on that non-sprint weekend in Monza, and it paid dividends. So if we have a dry weekend and Ferrari tend to have a good track record there, then maybe we can see a breakthrough on the Limitless on that front. I also like Singapore, though. I think that's a quite difficult track for overtakes, but it is a street circuit, so I think that maybe has a little bit more risk as well.
I like Singapore too, actually. It makes a lot of sense just because the top drivers will probably handle that better than the rookies. So maybe it's a good weekend to get out of some of those higher DNF risk drivers and stick with the safe guys at the top. So Singapore is totally safe too.
100%. Now on the other probably very powerful chip in the game, we've got the 3X DRS Boost. Neither of us have used that chip, and we find it can be much more powerful later in the season when our teams can afford two premium drivers without having to sacrifice one of our A-tier constructors. We've got 3 sprints coming up. I think we saw a lot of people use it in one of the remaining 3 sprints last year. I very much think that's going to be the case this time around as well.
I totally agree. And so if we look at those 3 sprint races, COTA is usually dry. The top drivers typically perform well. It's a driver's circuit. A lot of people really like it there. So I think that's going to be the safest place and where a lot of folks are going to use that chip. Brazil, as we saw last season, can get quite wet. So I think people will probably avoid Brazil because you could have no negative autopilot. One of the chips we'll talk about in a few minutes there. But if you're trying to chase that P1 in your mini league, maybe you save it for Qatar. Also a dry race, maybe something where you could get a bit of a differential magic. But for me, I'm probably aiming for COTA.
Yeah, I'm inclined to do the same. I know we still talk about the trauma from 2 years ago with those disqualifications, but I do think COTA stands out as the most logical candidate. I used it in Qatar, but that was last year because of the fact my budget was slightly on the lower side, was backed into a corner. Ultimately ended up using it pretty much on the same drive as I would have used it on anyway had I gone in COTA in Qatar. But it is a dry track. I guess the only reservation I have for using it in the very last sprint race of the season is just because you're ultimately backed into a corner to using it in that race if you choose to wait it out. So we've got some thoughts, but I think sprint weekends seem to be like the unanimous verdict for using the chip for the 3X. Now, the no negative. I think that's one that a lot of people have had mixed fortunes with this season. We've had a lot of wet races, but I don't think we're out of the woods quite yet with these treacherous conditions, particularly at circuits like Interlagos, as you mentioned before. Do you see any merit in using it not at Brazil? Because I feel like that's light years apart from the other tracks we've got on the calendar, but I wonder if there's other opportunities for people that want to go a little different.
Yeah, first off, I want to pour one out for those of us that use no negative back at Spa. If you aren't aware of how unfortunate no negative was then, it saved me 3 points on a wet sprint weekend. It is unheard of levels of unlucky. So sorry for those of you that joined me on the wrong side of that ship. But obviously Brazil, a great circuit for it. It's a sprint weekend and it could be wet. One other weekend, again, we just talked about it a moment ago for the 3X chip, but maybe Qatar or 5 DNFs last season. It's a hot weekend, sprint weekend. So maybe you could have some car failures as teams are trying to just not use some new engine parts at the end of the season. So that could be a fun one. And Singapore, similarly, if it's wet, it could be treacherous. And so if you have a team full of rookies, maybe you are running a 4-tier A lineup and you need to run the likes of Lawson, Bortoleto, or Colapinto at the back of your team, no negative will buffer against those drivers getting thrown into the wolves at a wet street circuit.
I mean, that's an excellent point. I was going to say something to that effect as well. If you're running a bunch of rookies to get the 3X chip or position your team for the 3X chip in a subsequent week, then covering off as that insurance policy, I think a perfect opportunity for that. But yeah, there aren't really too many. I guess if I look back at the first 14 races of the season, weekends such as Belgium, for sure, it's not necessarily the warmest weekend, but I don't think at the start of the year a lot of people were eyeing it off until we obviously got to the weekend. Miami, similarly. Like, I don't think until we got to that weekend where it was torrential rain, people were seriously considering the no negative. So, and then you look at the likes of Australia and Silverstone, non-sprint weekends, but we had a myriad of DNFs on both of those, downfalls. So I do think there's potentially, if we get to a Mexico or a Las Vegas, if there's rain there, then I think it's perfectly fine to use on a non-sprint weekend too. Okay. Now, yeah, so I think these are probably the ones that, the 3 we've already talked about, the ones that have had or can protect or increase the points or preserve the points we have available to us. The next 3 are probably some of the more nuanced chips in the game, but the wildcard for me, I think, has a lot of merit, particularly where we're at right now with this meta or template lineup shift. You've already used your wildcard, if I'm not mistaken, Adam.
I did, yeah. So I made 6 transfers in one weekend, so it was not a mild card. I went all out on it. It was a pure wild card for me. But I do wish I had it now, because as I try to move into a 4 tier A team, I'm either going to have to do it in 2 steps or take a -10 to get there. So I've got to be very careful.
Yeah, I think it feels like a very natural point in the season to use it if people haven't yet used it. And I myself have it up my sleeve. I'm very inclined to consider it either in one of the next 2 or 3 race weekends. This is obviously going out right. Oh, we're recording this right before Zandvoort, but we'll go out around Monza. I think it's probably for me being used in the next 2 or 3 weekends. I don't want to obviously back myself into a corner where in a subsequent week I want to use an autopilot, where at that point I would have 2 premium drivers in my team. So I'm probably inclined to use it sooner. I am carrying 3 free transfers, so I'm flushed with swaps right now. But I do think there's probably an opportunity for many people, if you've got the budget to pivot into that 4A, that it probably feels like the right time to use it.
And for me, a lot of people ask, is -10 enough to use the wild card? Within the next few races, we're getting to that point of the year where any negative score is worth eliminating with the wild card.
Agreed.
If we were talking back in the first 2 or 3 races of the season, make sure it's at least a -20 to get your money's worth. But as we get to the last few races, you might not have another opportunity to take a -10 and prevent it with that chip, so use it while you can.
The only other scenario, and I guess it's hard to predict a particular weekend when wildcard is optimal, but the only other scenario I see it where having value is if in the off chance we have a situation where highly owned meta assets all DNF and the likes of Oscar Piastri, maybe the McLaren constructor, maybe one of the maybe not 4.5, but maybe like a Fernando Alonso, all DNF, and they're all expected to go down in the subsequent weekend, like 0.6 or a 0.3 drop seems inevitable. Almost pivoting out of those assets for a week or 2, if you've got the wildcard handy, also seems like a very natural jumping off point where everyone else would obviously have to eat those drops for a week if they're not prepared to, move them on.
That's a great point, Rob, because as you think about the title battle between Norris and Piastri, once McLaren locks up the Constructors' title, I think the gloves are off. And you could have incidents, they've already come close to touching already this year. It could get quite ugly at the end of the season. So if you're 2X driver and your top constructor, eat a bunch of DNFs, and you do have to make a big shift, wildcard could be helpful there.
Definitely, yeah. Now we're getting more into the nitty-gritty of hard to predict chips. The autopilot for me is a bit of an interesting one because I feel like you get the most value of it when you've got 2 premium drivers. Again, like I said, there's probably a time soon or where there's wet weather where we could use it. But I'm finding a hard time to rationalize if it's better on sprints, if it's better on non-sprints. I'd love to do the analyses, but I just feel like there's a lot of back of the napkin, or as Ewan likes to call it, loosey-goosey math to understand whether or not the autopilot chip makes sense on a non-sprint or a sprint weekend. What's your read of it for the last kind of 10 races or so? Because I understand you've also got that handy.
Yeah, just to double click on something you said a moment ago, I definitely wait until you have 2 tier A assets, because what are the odds that Hülkenberg outscores a McLaren? Obviously, it happened at Silverstone. In the case of Australia, he outscored Piastri in the wet, but it's pretty rare. I would make sure you have 2 tier A assets, even if you have to run the likes of Sauber or Haas as your second constructor to afford something like that. You want to make sure it's a race where that DRS boost could actually move. As for which races I'm looking at, you and I were at Vegas last season, Rob. It was a cool night race. We had Mercedes 1-2 in that particular race. And then in 2023, the top 4 fantasy scorers were Verstappen, Leclerc, Ocon, and Stroll. So some weird stuff can happen under the lights in Vegas. So maybe you run the likes of a Piastri and a Russell with the autopilot chip and just see if it changes hands.
Yeah, definitely. I think it, for me, where I want to have a bit more fun with my lineups, where budget building later in the season, the last 5-6 races is probably less important. That's where I'll be throwing a bit more caution to the wind and willing to kind of chance my hands. Look, there might be a wet race, let's call it Interlagos, where by that point we've all got 4A, or 2 premium drivers, 2 premium constructors, and it's raining as well. I'm just at that point willing to protect the 2X, and that point the autopilot comes into play. But if it gets to a point where we don't really have an obvious weekend for the autopilot, like you say, I might just throw it on any weekend, and Las Vegas seems like a very natural fit for that.
Absolutely.
And final fix, probably the most unpredictable chip in the entire F1 fantasy multiverse. I know you've talked a little bit about it with grid penalties on the fantasy formula. I know there are certain instances where it can perhaps have value at low overtake tracks if your 2x driver qualifies out of position. But the Monacos, the Budapests are out of the way. We've got, I suppose Singapore, but where does the final fix come into play? We haven't seen a lot of grid penalties this year either.
No, so I'll throw a couple of situations out there in case they happen, and maybe there'll be some other ones that pop in between now and then. So we talked about Verstappen's engine penalty at Brazil in 2024. He gained those 16 positions. And then in the case of Charles Leclerc, he had 16 positions gained at Abu Dhabi. So these are two circuits where you can make up a ton of positions. So looking to see if your 2X driver finds himself really caught out or taking an engine penalty. So I suspect someone will eventually take it by the end of the year. So maybe you'll want to either get out of a 2X driver that's falling way down or get into a 2X driver that has the potential to gain a lot of positions. And then looking, like you said a moment ago, Rob, at these low overtake circuits, I think back to Monza, where last season Verstappen in a championship winning car qualified 7th and only finished 6th. So if you have the likes of Piastri or Norris as your 2X driver, they have a tough Q3 at Monza, you might want to get out of them for these drivers like Charles Leclerc, who's always strong in that home Ferrari race.
100%. Yeah, I definitely think that's probably one of the standout options for me. The only other situation where I really feel it has the most upside, but you just have you couldn't predict it, is when drivers have DNSs before the race starts. Last year, I think it was Leclerc on the way to the grid was it Interlagos or was it 2 years ago? A DNS before the race. And so, or maybe it was on the formation lap, so it doesn't matter. But if you look at drivers that withdraw, 20, 30 minutes before the race, final fix, I feel like seems like a very obvious chip to use at that point. The problem is, again, we can't predict that. And also the tricky thing with that is you don't want to obviously use one chip that then blocks you from using the final fix, because as we know, we can't use 2 chips in a weekend. I'm currently going on a bit of a tangent here, but what I'm trying to say is there are so many different eventualities which makes it so difficult to use, and I feel as though it's going to be a bit of a crapshoot the later in the year we get. So it could be, given it doesn't really do anything to the value or the budget change that a driver has later in the year, where budget's probably less of a priority, feels like a natural time to use that chip.
Absolutely. I wouldn't stress over it too much. It's going to be a dice roll. Either you're trying to capture someone climbing up the grid or prevent a big drop of someone who's fallen lower than they should. Ultimately, it really just comes down to chance in that moment. I think last year I didn't use it at all. I just didn't have the opportunity to use it. And then the year before I ended up with fewer points than if I just stayed with my original selection. So unless you have one of these weird things like a last minute DNS, or you really just want to take a shot at an elite driver coming up from the back of the grid, I would just wait.
Cool. Great. So that's all 6 chips out of the way. If I could get before we jump into the Fast 5 quiz, Adam, if I could put you on the spot and you have to use all 6 chips, you've got all 6 available to you in a theoretical scenario, you've got to use all 6 before the end of the year across the next 10 races. If you can go top to bottom from Limitless all the way down to Final Fix, where would you use those 6 chips?
All right. Limitless, going right to Monza. Let's get that out of the way soon.
Love it.
3X Boost, Coda.
Yep.
Wildcard. For my team, I don't think I'm going to get into a comfy 4 Tier A lineup until could be as late as
what's after Monza,
Mexico.
right?
Yeah, it would probably be just after Monza. So maybe in the race, I'd say somewhere between Monza and Coda, if I'm allowed to cheat somewhere in between there, maybe Singapore.
Baku, Singapore. Yeah,
Baku,
exactly.
Yeah. Let's say Baku, because I don't think I'll have another chip lined up for that. No negative. Let's use in Singapore. I'm going to put some good juju that'll rain there.
Mm-hmm.
Autopilot in Vegas. Final fix.
Love it.
Let's say some crazy stuff's going to happen in Brazil.
Got it. Okay, that's good. I think I was thinking this similar for a few different, and I'll flash a visual up on kind of what your analysis is, and then what I think my perspective is. I'll go a little different, so there's a couple of different options for the viewers out there. But if I could start with Limitless, you said Monza. I'm gonna say Singapore for the low overtake. It's also not too far down the line where it kind of inhibits people from that delta we talked about. Then the 3x boost, you said Coda, right? So I would probably, to be different, I'd go then Qatar, because I used it there last year. It was okay, but I think Coda for me still the standout 3x option. Then for no negative, I think for me it would be Brazil. I think 2 sessions worth of DNF risk. If it rains, it has had a bit of haphazard weather there the last couple of years. No negative. Where did you say that was again? Singapore, right? And right. Then Wildcard I'd probably use in Monza, kind of that jumping off point, or one of those next few races after the summer break for that 4A shift. Autopilot, I would probably go Vegas. Did you say Vegas, Autopilot, or did you say somewhere else? You did. Okay, all right. Then in that case, I'm going to go Baku. Street circuit, a little bit risky. I think by that point, a lot of people will have a Russell, Piastri, or some other variation of the 2 premium drivers. And then final fix, I'm going to throw it on the very last race of the season. Let's have fun. You can't obviously lose any value by Abu Dhabi, so let's go final fix for the last race of the season. But yeah, great robust discussion on chips. So thank you for talking that out, Adam. We'll have hopefully 9 or 10 races worth of runway to get people's thoughts on whether or not our chip strategies make any sense or nothing at all for that matter. So we're getting into the pointy end of the show. The Fast 5 F1 Fantasy Quiz. We've had Tom, Pop Pan Man, Ewan from F1 Fantasy Pole Position, Rain from Rain Fantasy, and now yourself. I think you've definitely been around F1 Fantasy for long enough to hopefully have a bit of a grasp on what to expect from the F1 Fantasy statistics and insights and analysis. The highest score for reference is 3 out of 5. So it's not easy, but I've also tried to make it not borderline impossible. So how are you feeling about it?
I'll tell you, as much as I know about the game, I'm terrible with retention and I choke at trivia. So I'm going to be sweating throughout the whole thing, but I'm ready to give it a shot.
One thing I will say is sometimes just talk out, speak out loud when you're thinking about logical answers. Because I think for me, I guess I'm the one that's written the questions, but I find the more I think about it and talk about it out loud, the more it can actually make sense. But anyway, we'll see how you go. I'm sure you'll be fine. So, all right, question number 1, Adam. Start with hopefully what's an easy one. Who has the highest average score in F1 Fantasy after the Hungarian Grand Prix?
I think Lando with the win overtook Piastri to be number 1.
That is correct. Lando did win, in fact, in Hungary, but he's in fact averaged less than Oscar Piastri over that 4-race span. Yes, he did have 36 versus Oscar's 29 in Hungary, but Oscar's outscored him in the previous 3 races before that. So he's getting closer and closer. Yes, Oscar is just off the pace, but you're right. Lando Norris averaging 35.7 points per race. So off the mark there, a great omen for hopefully what to expect for the rest of the quiz. Question number 2. Which race weekend had the lowest average driver score per year? So when you average out all of the driver scores in that single race weekend, keep in mind that includes sprint scoring as well, what weekend had the lowest average?
What's the time period of it? Is it just this season, or is
yes,
it over?
Sorry, yes, from 2025, yes.
All right, I'm going to talk with my hands so people don't think I'm searching for this for the answer while I'm talking through it.
It's all good.
I'm thinking it would be a non-sprint weekend, something where we've had a lot of DNFs. So Australia comes to mind. That was a high DNF weekend. Silverstone was a high DNF weekend. I'm going to, because Australia had a lot of overtakes too, I'm going to take a shot and say it was your home race in Australia. Maybe you picked it because there's the Australian tie to it.
You're 100% correct. Australia is the right answer. You're flying off to a great start so far. Averaging in that first race of the season, Australia averaged 6 points per driver. Silverstone just behind with only 7.5. So you're on the money. Non-sprint weekends where there's less points on the table. Wet weather races where there are more DNFs. So well thought out, Adam. A great start. Now we're going to get into hopefully a few trickier questions, but I think 2 out of 2 so far, a great start to the quiz. Question number 3. I have to word this precisely so it makes sense. If we take only the sprint scoring sessions of the sprint race weekends we've had in 2025, So we're not looking at qualifying points. We're not looking at race points. We're only looking at sprint scoring points in F1 Fantasy. Which driver has recorded the most points across the sprint race weekends in 2025?
Okay, so we're talking about just the sprint race. We've had 3 so far. Thinking in my mind it's going to be one of the 2 McLarens or Verstappen. Can I remember what happened in China and Miami?
Thankfully, thankfully the disqualifications obviously didn't affect anyone in the. It was Grand Prix related, not sprint related, of course, as well.
Right. Was that a clue that it should be a Ferrari?
Did I give something away by accident?
So for those of you playing at home, Rob said luckily the disqualifications didn't play into the score. Now only one team has been disqualified thoroughly through some of our sprint weekends.
Terrible quizmaster, if you ask me.
I don't have a good sense of who it would be, so I'm going to hope that was a tell and say Charles Leclerc.
Oh, you're so close. It was actually Lewis Hamilton, your man.
Oh my guy, I'm wearing the jersey.
I did accidentally kind of give a hint there, which was unintentional. But yes, Lewis Hamilton has scored 37 F1 fantasy points across the 3 sprint race weekends. Lance Stroll, second with 27. But you have to think that's largely on the back of the fact overtakes and positions gained in the sprint races are sometimes even more valuable than the placement points. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't have the stats up in front of me, but I think Lewis had the win in China and then not back of the grid, but quite some ways back overtakes. It must have been Miami or Belgium at that point. So yeah, box seat for those results. So 2 out of 3, still very much in contention for a podium in the quiz. Question number 4: who averages the most Grand Prix overtakes in F1 Fantasy in 2025?
Oh, I knew this up until a few races ago. They're usually Haas are among the highest overtakers on the grid. Magnussen took the category last year. It was, up until a few races ago, at least Ollie Behrman, but he did DNF, and I can't tell. I'm trying to figure out if he still had that lead. It would be some combination of Behrman, his teammate Ocon, the legendary Lance Stroll. They're always up there for overtakes. Antonelli's been coming from the back of the grid. He's had a lot of overtakes. I'm going to take a stab at it and say Ollie Behrman pulled off enough overtakes to hold on to his lead and keep Haas in its overtake glory.
That's a great answer. Great reasoning, Adam. That's correct. Behrman averages 4.4 overtakes per race weekend, per Grand Prix, I should say, in 2025. He is tied with Nico Hülkenberg after a masterclass of races lately with 4.4 overtakes for the season. I would have given the answer to either of them had you answered Hülkenberg or Behrman. So great work. 3 out of 4 so far. Heading into the last few laps of the quiz. And 4 out of 5 would secure you a podium. 3 out of 5 would secure you a points finish. So hopefully you can end up on one of the top 3 steps. Question number 5. Who has the most driver of the day wins in 2025?
Yeah, let's see. This used to be such a runaway. You'd say Lando Norris, lick the stamp and send it. He's got a bazillion of it. But this year, it's been everybody. Like so many different drivers have had a turn that I think whoever has the most driver of the day wins probably has 2.
You're not a bad shout, yeah.
And so, who has 2? I think Antonelli wrapped up a couple at the beginning of the season. I think Max had a couple of master classes in there, but I don't know if they were good enough for 2 driver of the day wins. I don't think either McLaren pulled off multiple driver of the day titles. I'm going to take a shout at Kimi Antonelli.
So close. Unfortunate. It was Max with 3, in fact. Antonelli does have 2, and you have to be forgiven for thinking he probably actually deserved one in Australia, which he didn't win. But Max tops out driver of the days with 3, with wins in Saudi Arabia, Imola, and Spain. And then Antonelli's China and Canadian driver of the day results propels him to 2. Fascinatingly, Bortoleto has won 2 out of the last 4 in Austria and Hungary, And then Lewis Hamilton has picked up Driver of the Days in Bahrain and Belgium. So you were right on the money with 2, but it's Max. For some reason, when he's in a terrible car, he seems to have the favoritism with the voters. So a great showing regardless. I will say there were some tricky curveballs in there, but you did excellently, Adam. And 3 out of 5 ties you for first of those visitors, or guests, I should say, on the channel for the Fast 5 F1 Fantasy Quiz. So thank you for playing along. It was a great result.
I'll take it, Rob. I'm tied with some people that I really admire, so as long as I didn't put up a goose egg, I'm happy.
Brilliant result. All right. Well, that wraps things up for the video today. But before we close things out, Adam, I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to talk strategy with Chips. With 10 races left, and they'll be flying thick and fast for the remainder of the year. Before we wrap up, where can people find you on social channels? I'll have them in the description below, but do say so as well.
You can find me all over the place at FanAmp Fantasy HQ on all your favorite socials, on the FanAmp YouTube channel, or on fanamp.com/fantasy for my written stuff.
Awesome. Well, again, as I said, please do check out Adam's content. He's one of the brightest F1 fantasy minds in the game, and as always, a pleasure to chat F1 fantasy, particularly chip strategy, which I think is going to be such an important component of the remaining 10 races in 2025. So, Adam, look, thank you again for coming on. I had an absolute pleasure, and it's been great to catch up and just talk all things F1 fantasy.
Thanks so much for having me, Rob. This was a blast.
Awesome. So folks, this rounds out my guest interview series on the channel for 2025. I really hope you've enjoyed all of the individuals I've had on to discuss Formula One, F1 fantasy, and everything in between. That doesn't mean the content train stops though. I will still continue with team selection, final thoughts, and live stream videos throughout the rest of the 2025 F1 season. So as always, as I've said before, and I will continue to say, if you're enjoying the content, you're liking what you're seeing, please do show some love to the channel. A like, a subscription goes a very long way. I will be back with more of my content in the coming weeks as we approach the pointy end of the F1 season. But in the meantime, have a great day, and I will see you all very soon.